Welcome to the 8th Annual Seattle Area.
The Seattle Epidemiologic Research and Information Center, in collaboration with the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA Employee Education System, and the University of Washington Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, presents the 8th Annual Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session.
Good morning. Welcome to the 8th Annual Seattle ERIC Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session. My name is Ed Boyko. I'm the course director. The title of today's course is Epidemiologic Aspects of Military Post-Deployment Health Conditions, Natural Disasters, and Terrorism. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ken Taneda, who is a senior researcher of the Department of Policy Sciences at the National Institute of Public Health in Japan. He spent 6 years here in Seattle as a fellow in health services and epidemiology training programs, where I served as one of his mentors. And he also is a clinical instructor in the Department of Health Services School of Public Health at the University of Washington. The title of his talk today is Epidemiologic Aspects of Terrorist Acts. Dr. Taneda.
Thank you very much, Ed. It is my great pleasure to have an opportunity to share my experience at St. Luke's International Hospital, Tokyo, in the immediate aftermath of the sarin gas attack with you. This session is the second part of my presentation. In the first session, I presented a chaotic situation during the first couple of hours after the attack. In this second session, I'd like to present what happened after that, and summarize the incident and the lessons we learned. I'd like to talk about emergent temporary patient holding and treatment areas. Around 9:30, the decision was made to convert non-medical spaces, such as corridors or hallways and the chapel, into those areas. In addition, we admitted the patients into a non-medical ward, which was being used as a hotel section for patients' family, and also rooms, which had already been scheduled for routine admissions for the next couple of days. So here is a question for you. How would you deal with overflow patients at your institution? This is a picture of the spacious hallway corridor. Then on the day of the attack, the corridors turned out to be like this picture. Another picture of the hallway. You can see IV fluid stands, and the victims were receiving some treatment there. This is the entrance of the chapel. We have a chapel inside the hospital. This is the inside of the chapel. This is a wall inside the chapel, and what you can see here is the outlets of oxygen, compressed air, and suction. The chapel was designed to be a patient overflow area, and then equipped with these outlets for emergency. This is a closer picture of the outlet. You can see a green oxygen hose. This is the inside of the chapel on the day of the attack. Here's another picture of the chapel. And another picture of the chapel. You can see many IV fluids stands and the cross of the chapel. Although this chapel was very useful emergency care site, it was a kind of very tight place without many windows to outside. In fact, its ventilation of air was very poor. In addition, since we didn't know the causative agent early on, we didn't even think about decontamination. As a result, about 50% of staff working in this area complained of the similar symptoms to those of patients. One of the staff also developed an asthmatic attack. Some staff showed miosis or small pupils of eyes. One of the staff was admitted later. We suspected a secondary exposure of sarin gas, probably from patients' belongings, such as clothing. Then we studied decontamination sometime in the afternoon. Since the secondary exposure was a major concern, we administered the questionnaire to 1,063 hospital personnel at 3 months after the incident. The response rate was 44%. Then we found that 23% of the personnel had some kinds of symptoms. This pie chart shows the proportion of type of providers among the 472 responders to the questionnaire. The most of responders were nurse, and then followed by co-medical staff, clerks, and so on. This is the frequency of their symptoms. Major 4 symptoms were eye symptoms, headache, sore throat, and dyspnea. This graph shows the proportion of those who complained of any symptoms by the type of providers. The most affected providers was nurse aide, and 40% of them had some symptoms, and then followed by nurse, volunteer, and so on. In average, 23% of them had symptoms. We also looked at the proportion by working area on the day. The area where the most personnel were affected was the chapel, around 40%, and then followed by outpatient department corridor, general ward, and so on. Around 11 o'clock, the first typed handouts were distributed by the literature retrieval group. Actually, after the discussion in the group, I typed the handout. Although I was not good at typing first, I thought a typed handout would be much better rather than the handwritten one in terms of legibility, particularly in such a chaotic situation. Then I printed out many copies and distributed them to staff at each location by myself. Nobody told me to do so, but I thought this would be my role as a chief resident. One of the amazing things I remember was that most hospital personnel found their role voluntarily in such a chaotic situation, and then it worked very well. In the handout, we included the information not only for care providers, but also for patients. So here is another question for you. Who would be in charge of emergent information network or communication within your institution? And how would you distribute the information? This is the actual handout I made. Around 2 o'clock, we had a second triage for disposition of mild cases. Staff physicians examined all ambulatory patients regarding the need for admission or discharge. Then around 5 o'clock, patients with mild symptoms were allowed to go home. This is a waiting room of the outpatient department where we held the second triage. The same waiting room turned out to be like this crowded place. This is a brief summary of all patients' conditions at the end of the first day. We triaged the patients into 3 categories: mild, moderate, and severe. The number of mild cases who had only eye symptoms was 628. They were ultimately released after a half-day close observation. There were 107 moderate cases with other systematic signs and symptoms. They were admitted. The number of severe cases requiring intubations and artificial ventilation was 5. We had a lot of support from the outside of the hospital, and I have listed some of them here. Many volunteers, including off-duty staff, who came to assist us. For example, one of my colleagues was taking vacation at a remote place at the time, but after knowing the attack on TV, he flew back to the hospital to help us. We received 30 portable beds from Tokyo Metropolitan Government. We also received extra payphones and cell phones, which I think were very helpful for many patients and their families and colleagues. Since many staff didn't have time to go to even a hospital cafeteria for lunch or dinner, we also appreciated the food donated by a nearby hotel. By the way, staff could get exhausted and hungry soon or later. Staffing or shift of hospital personnel would be another important issue to consider. This is a chapel inside of a hospital. In the late afternoon of that day, you can see IV fluid stands, portable beds from the government, and plastic bags, black plastic bags in which patients' belongings were packed. This is a list of admitted patients on the wall of the main hallway of the hospital. After the discussion of complicated potential problems regarding the patient's privacy or confidentiality, we decided listing the names of victims on the wall. As a result, we think that this listing helped us to give patients information to their families, friends, and colleagues. So you have to think about how you would deal with patients' information at your institution in particular in this era of HIPAA legislation. Around 11 o'clock in the night, I distributed the second handout by visiting all wards and temporary accommodation areas. The handout included the following information: the names of at least 2 physicians who are in charge of each care site, instructions of treatment, laboratory order for the next morning, the schedule of the next day's strategy meeting. This is the actual handout I prepared. The next day was a holiday, fortunately, so we didn't have to worry about the scheduled clinics, admissions, operations, or a lot of other routine work. At 9 o'clock, we had a meeting to discuss strategies for that day. Then we examined the 110 hospitalized patients. Ultimately, 80 patients were allowed to go home. Around 10:30 a.m., I made a third handout based on the discussion of the strategy meeting. It included information on treatment, outpatient clinic, telephone consultation, and the next day's meeting, and administrative procedures for discharge, which was also as important as treatment since usual administrative process was not applicable. This is the actual handout. On the second day of the attack, our colleagues recognized the risks of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Psychiatric liaison nurse was consulted about 6 inpatients who showed improvement physical symptoms due to sarin gas, but complained of nightmare, insomnia, unstable mental status, and depression, although they did not have any history of psychiatric illness before. After the recognition, the psychiatric team developed educational handouts regarding PTSD for patients and then distributed them. So I'd like you to consider psychiatric care available from early on in your preparedness plan. This table shows the number of victims we saw during the week of the attack. The first column shows the date. The second column shows the numbers of outpatients on each date, which include only new patients. As you can see here, on the third day and the fourth day after the holiday, we saw many patients at the clinic, probably including the worried well who had no sarin gas exposure. The third column shows the numbers of inpatients. Until the fourth day, most inpatients were discharged. The second last column shows the total number of patients we saw on each date. The last column shows the number of deaths. We had a second death on April 28th, around 1 month after the attack. The total number of unique patients we saw for that week was 1,410. I'd like to talk about the transportation of the patients to a hospital. Interestingly, most patients came on their own foot. As you saw in the videotape, taxi or cab was secondary major transportation, then followed by cars of passing Good Samaritans, cars of Tokyo Metro Fire Department, ambulances, and police cars. Therefore, most patients, around 70%, were walk-ins by their own foot, taxi, or private cars. In terms of patients' characteristics, their age ranged from 8 years old to 65 years old, and the average age was 35 years old. There were 395 male patients and 245 female patients, including 5 pregnant women. Their pregnancy was 9 weeks through the 36 weeks of the gestation, and 13 children we saw. Although 4 pregnant women delivered the healthy babies eventually, one lady decided to have an abortion early on because of a potential adverse effect of sarin gas on the baby. Unfortunately, we could not say for sure about the adverse effect of the sarin gas on their babies and children's growth. I think they are most vulnerable patients, but they are often forgotten at the stage of preparedness against terrorist attacks. So I'd like you to make sure whether you have a plan to take care of those patients as well. This is a summary of our patients' outcomes. Although we had 2 patients who died, the rest of the patients recovered and they were subsequently discharged without severe adverse effects. This is a list of the signs and the symptoms of the patients on the patient's arrival at the hospital. Almost all patients, 90%, showed miosis or small pupils of eyes, then followed by headache, visual darkness, eye pain, and so on. This is a list of the symptoms on the patient's discharge from the hospital. The most frequently observed symptom was eye symptoms, followed by headache, nausea, and so on. So they had still some symptoms when they were discharged. In terms of the laboratory data, the most remarkable change was low plasma cholinesterase values. The rest of the findings were relatively minor and probably not sarin gas specific effects. So the low plasma cholinesterase is probably the most sensitive lab data. So more than 20% patients did not show the low plasma cholinesterase. So maybe those patients could be just a worried well who had very minor or no sarin gas exposure. So one of my colleagues at St. Luke's, Dr. Ishimatsu, recently reviewed the medical records to find out the possible number of the worried well. He reviewed the total in total 627 medical records. And among those, 85 patients did not show any symptoms. Then among them, 43 patients had a normal choline Then 23 among those 40 patients did not mention any relation to the subway station. That is around 4%. And among those patients, 70 patients did not show a meiosis. So around 4%, 5% patients could be just the worried well. Dr. Ishimatsu also re-reviewed the survey results we conducted 1 month after the attack. We received 475 responses. Among them, 33 victims, which is around 70%, said they were not on the subway and they did not have any relation directly to subway stations at the time. Since we have limited hospital resources and the worried well could become actual real victims due to the secondary contamination, we need to consider ahead how to deal with those worried well. This is a list of the treatment for admitted patients. We secured an IV line for all of the patients and conducted decontamination later on and administered atropine and PAM, which is an antidote of sarin gas. This graph shows the dosage distribution of total administered atropine sulfate among the mild cases. Most cases received atropine from 0.5 to 1.5 milligram. This is the distribution of the dosage of total administered atropine sulfate among the admitted patients who were moderate and severe cases. Some of them needed more than 4 milligram atropine sulfate. This is a distribution of the dosage of total administered 2-PAM in moderate and severe cases. More than 50 patients received from 1 to 1.5 gram of PAM. As you could imagine from those graphs, the stock of those antidotes would be very critical to deal with mass casualties, particularly due to chemical terrorist attacks. Compared to the biological agents, the time window during which you could intervene to save patients would be very limited. With regard to our hospital stock of medications, we had 100 ampoules of 2-PAM and 1,030 ampoules of atropine sulfate stored, which were fortunately enough for the initial treatment. Then our pharmaceutical department made an additional order to wholesale dealers early on. Ultimately, we used 700 ampoules of 2-PAM and 2,800 ampoules of atropine sulfate. It would be not easy to anticipate the enough amount of stockpile of medications at each institution. However, you may need to think about how you would get the enormous extra medications as soon as possible if needed. This graph shows the frequency of patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, up to the year 2000. The St. Luke's International Hospital, Tokyo, have been followed the patients. Regardless any criteria of PTSD, some patients continue to suffer from somatic and psychological symptoms even 5 years after the incident. According to the criterion recommended by Dr. Nakano, showed in yellow line with triangles on this graph, there were even new cases with PTSD later on. Dr. Nakano is a former psychiatrist of the hospital. he and his colleagues recognized that the conventional PTSD criterion could not cover many sarin gas patients who really needed psychological care. It may be in part due to the cultural difference in response to the incident among Japanese. Therefore, Dr. Nakano has suggested the criterion including traumatized patients with unexplained physical symptoms, and he called those patients masked PTSD. I think this would be clinically a very important point, particularly in the United States, since you need to take care of patients with diverse backgrounds and identify patients who need psychological care and treatment with consideration of cultural differences. By the way, the recent study our colleagues conducted showed that their PTSD symptoms became worse when the September 11th attack occurred in the United States. Probably the attack reminded them their sarin gas attack experience. This is a survey result our colleagues conducted recently, 10 years after the attack. There are still some patients who complain symptoms which seem related to the sarin gas attack, even after 10 years. The experience of Tokyo subway sarin attack demonstrated many important issues in dealing with mass casualties due to an unknown causative agent. I have listed some of them here. First of all, before this attack, we believed that Japan was one of the safest cities in the world. We never ever thought this type of terrorist incident and mass casualties could happen to us. But this is what happened. Unfortunately, it could also happen to you anywhere and anytime. Secondly, most victims were walk-ins. Ideally, we want to keep all the victims on the site and let them go through the decontamination and triage processes. But it would not be possible. So you have to have plans for decontamination and evaluation of patients at your institution. Thirdly, many patients we saw, particularly at the clinic after the second day, they might have been worried wells who had very minor or no sarin gas exposure. So you also have to think about how to identify and triage them as well. Fourthly, surge capacity such as personnel, transportations, medications, beds, food, communication modalities, and so on were needed. Some of them are necessary immediately to save your patients. Lastly, and most importantly, there was a need for communication, not only among personnel within hospital, but also between providers and patients, and between hospital and outside agencies. Through the sarin gas attack, we also found that there was a good sense of medical professionalism and dedication to the victims among the hospital personnel. Well-considered plans and preparations against terrorist attacks are very important. However, it would never be perfect. Therefore, fostering this kind of hospital environment, esprit de corps, could be the key to dealing with unexpected incidents. In order to do so, communicating to each other through developing hospital disaster plans and repeating drills would be very important. Although we are very pleased to see that through our teamwork, we could successfully care for a large number of victims, we could have done better jobs if we had had better plans and more drills. I'd like to acknowledge my former colleagues and mentors at St. Luke's International Hospital, Tokyo, faculties at the University of Washington, who helped me to develop my presentation. And I'd like to answer the questions if you have.
Thank you for well done presentation.
Thank you.
So well done. I was wondering what with the review of the medical records for the worried well, what was the definition used for worried well?
My colleague, Dr. Ishimazu, reviewed 627 medical records. So he found that 81 patients did not have specific symptoms related to the sarin gas, sarin nerve gas. Okay? So among those with no symptoms, he also found that 43 patients did not have any low plasma cholinesterase. So lab data also confirmed that those patients did not.
Okay.
And so on. So ultimately, and also according to the patient's history, they said that they are not on the subway, and also they were not close to the subway stations. So at least 5% of those victims, they are just the worried well. I mean, they did not have probably exposed to any sarin gas.
Okay. So that was the development of the definition by that. Okay, thank you.
First, great job.
Thank you.
And I'd like to commend you for your quick thinking, for putting out a flyer that had consistent information, even if it doesn't have that much information on it. I think that's a very big thing to kind of quell the panic that people get because of rumors fly. And it's good to have the hospital staff and the administrator and the news media all kind of have the same amount. It's something that's very simple that can be done and probably overlooked in the majority of times, so good job.
Thank you.
The question I had is how prepared are you today, currently? What kind of programs does your hospital have in place now as a result of this, and also across Japan? Have they started any disaster plannings?
First of all, in general, unfortunately, many Japanese hospitals do not think that even though we had this kind of bad thing, probably wouldn't never happen again. And in fact, the Japanese government did not support our hospitals either. And our hospital, because of this kind of this experience, we developed some guideline how to triage the patients and how to make a team to discuss to each other and distribute the information through the entire hospital and so on.
I'm just actually surprised that seeing all these casualties coming into the emergency room, that somehow someone or a group of individuals had the presence of mind to form a literature review committee to try to find out what was happening, and it's just not the kind of reaction that would naturally occur. And so I'm just wondering what prompted that, because ultimately that was very helpful in understanding what was going on.
To be honest, who said that we needed to have a team, such a team, but we just didn't know at all about the agent, and so we eventually thought that we needed to have such a team to get our information on the agent and so on. And also the librarian, I think, believe the librarians helped us to get information as well.
I was wondering how, with developing esprit de corps, if you have any good tips on keeping the interest level in the group, the spirit. One of the things I've observed involved with keeping up interest in disaster drills. People don't take them as seriously, especially, when there's nothing, maybe because it did happen to you in the hospital, maybe it does keep the interest up. But I'm wondering if you had any good tips on how to keep the interest up and strategies.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, but maybe my videotape and today's presentation could encourage your colleagues to think about it, probably.
Sort of following up on the notion of the literature review, it strikes me that a lot of the disaster preparedness drills, at least here that occur here in the U.S., take as a starting point that the causative agent is known, and you all were presented with a scenario where people were coming in, they were clearly sick, and the causative agent was unknown, lack of information. And I think that's something that is probably under-recognized in our preparedness. I mean, we usually think, okay, well, here's a biological event, here's a chemical event, here's a radiation event, but it's not necessarily the case that we know a priori why all these people are rolling in sick, and the list of possibilities is large. So actually, I think just as part of the process of handling this, the notion that we need to have a separate piece that is trying to identify the causative agent is to be commended.
So I'm wondering whether there have been any investigations looking at the long-term neurologic sequelae of the gas attack.
Yeah, our colleagues have been following those patients, and there are still some patients who are complaining the symptoms, but they not seem to show any neurologic the damage.
I'm wondering if you talked about earlier the PTSD and maybe a modification in the definition. Proposed that maybe it's culturally based difference. But it seems to me that it may be threat-related differences in terms of the traumatic event here was to cause the kinds of symptoms that people are experiencing physically. And I wonder if you've considered that as something to look at with the remaining sequelae years later without the neurological findings. I think it's like Persian Gulf War syndrome. The threats there were of nerve agents and other kinds of similar threats.
I think we definitely need to have a continuing care for those patients. And one of the things I heard was the patients were very disappointed when the rest of people are forgetting what happened to them. So it's not just about the continuing care for those patients, but we always probably need to think about them. That probably could help them, I think. I'm sorry, maybe not clear answer to your question, but.
For the patients who do not meet DSM criteria but do meet the modified criteria, have people looked for HPA axis abnormalities?
I'm sorry, I'm not the expert in the area, but that is the suggestion one of the physicians mentioned to me. I don't have any further information.
What's the most valuable thing you learned in this entire experience?
Well,
Tough question, I know.
How much time do you have?
definitely the communication is very important. I'm saying repeatedly, but not only among the hospital personnel, but also the communications with the outside agencies and so on. And also, at that time, I personally printed out the handouts. And then I walked through all the hospitals and distributed by themselves. And I think nowadays people maybe communicate with each other via email and some using electronic stuff. But I don't think it would work when we have the similar event. So somehow you need to go back to the low-tech and print out just papers, then print it out and a lot, then just walk through the old warriors and talk to each other in person, I think. Any other comment, question? Okay, thank you very much for your kind attention.